May 8, 1945. A makeshift POW camp on the outskirts of Lübeck, northern Germany. Chill mist hangs over tangled barbed wire. Boots crunch on gravel. The air is tense, split between abrupt orders and the nervous laughter of young nurses, their faces pale beneath borrowed blankets. Somewhere, a pile of battered Red Cross crates collapses. British soldiers, uniformed but weary, stand in rigid lines, their eyes fixed on the horizon, as if they could see beyond the violence that swallowed Europe whole. Among a handful of seated German women, jittery hands clutch worn satchels, knuckles white. The youngest, Anna, 20, a former clerk, stares openly, almost defiantly, at the row of British guards. To her left, frail Katja dares to whisper, "We've never seen men like this. Not here. Not after all that's happened." A British officer, Captain Edwin Hayes, Oxford-educated, swept up by war's randomness, resumes his roll call, voice clipped, determined to hide his own nerves. Engines rumble somewhere past the wire. Anna's gaze doesn't break. He would later confess, years on, their eyes were desperate, not for freedom, but for some proof that dignity was possible in the world again. What none of them knew was that this camp would flip the logic of war. That in these stolen hours, captives would beg not for release, but for the strange sanctuary behind British wire. For months, the Western Allies had liberated millions, men, women, children, who'd vanished into Hitler's war machine. German cities lay smashed. Displaced survivors clogged every road. The captured, whether Wehrmacht, clerks, nurses, were processed in camps with little more than tarps and hurried paperwork. The numbers churned relentlessly. By summer's end, 3.5 million German POWs would be under Allied control in Europe. Of these, at least 500,000 were women. Some combatants, many clerical staff, most simply civilians swept up by front lines slicing across Germany's heart. Normal solutions failed. Rations vanished before dawn trucks could arrive. Medical care was patchwork, administered by medics with more hope than antibiotics. Each day, rumor raced through the ranks. Another death, another group condemned to forced repatriation, or worse, turned over to Soviet authorities. Worse was the emotional crisis. Letters from home spoke of bombed neighborhoods, missing brothers, cities where bread cost more than gold. Starvation and suicide stalked the edges of every policy memo. In theory, freedom awaited. In practice, release meant homelessness, persecution, or violence at the hands of rival factions. A British sergeant, William Toms, would write, "I never saw so many choose captivity over liberty. They knew what faced them outside." Bureaucracy plowed on, but its logic failed. Standard Geneva protocols didn't apply to women. The paperwork choked on ambiguity. Should nurses be moved? Should clerks be freed? The old systems broke under the weight of millions in motion. Among the British staff, innovation didn't come from headquarters, but from exhausted, overburdened junior officers and field nurses. One, Lieutenant Margaret Price, had lost her brother at Arnhem and saw the war's ruin up close. Assigned to oversee the health of POW women, she was haunted by the faces in her barracks, some just teenagers, some mothers, all terrified not of their captors, but of their own country's embrace. Margaret's flaw was her stubbornness. "I don't care about the paperwork," she barked at a clipboard-wielding major. "I care about keeping these girls alive, even if I have to rewrite the rules." Her obsession grew in the dead hours before dawn, when a hunger-bloated nurse, Elsa, collapsed mid-queue, or when women clung to photos of lost families, unwilling to step outside the wire. Margaret started compiling her own health logs, inventing distribution patterns for precious Red Cross chocolate and black market penicillin. Captain Hayes would say later, "She attended funerals here. She wrote letters for those who had no words. She wasn't a genius. She was steadfast. She refused the idea that kindness had to end at the edge of a uniform." Margaret and her counterparts challenged doctrine quietly, creatively, risking their commissions and their reputations to rewrite the rules of captivity. It happened in the gray calm after a rainstorm. Margaret Price sat beneath a ragged army tent, staring at a crude camp roster, her pencil tapping rhythmically against a tin mug. One column, names. Another, medical afflictions. The third, blank. She broke protocol, sketching a rough care map. Lines connecting women by age, illness, bitterness, and hope. Lifting her chin, she murmured, "If we treat them not as prisoners but as patients, if kindness flows through ration lines, maybe fear will ebb." Her finger traced a route. Nurses went first for clean water, then for protein rations. Young mothers received packages via a hidden barter system with British kitchen staff. Daily psychological check-ins, handwritten in code, became the new order. Margaret mapped empathy, defying logic. It was not brilliant, just obvious and wholly untested. Rumor spread, the British nurse sketches for us, not to punish, not to release, but to save. Anna, the young POW, described the moment. She wrote our stories in her little book. It felt like being remembered by the world. Opposition arrived swiftly. The camp major discovered the care map, his voice filled with disbelief. "You're rewriting Geneva. You're coddling the enemy. What's next? Tea and sympathy for traitors." Margaret, eyes resolute, replied simply, "We can't afford silence anymore." Among British command, memos circulated citing reckless innovation, unlawful leniency, and warnings of potential morale breakdown. Senior staff threatened demotion, transfer. Her methods are amateur nonsense, driven by sentimentality. Colonel Davis, an old-school administrator, barked during a stormy meeting, "This is illegal. This is not what war looks like." But Margaret's conviction bled into the ranks. Medical volunteers and junior officers whispered, "She's right. Too many deaths as it is." Some British staff bet their reputations. "If you fire her, I go too," murmured Sergeant Toms. A German nurse held behind wire wept as she spoke to Margaret. "I am enemy, but not evil. Let me heal with you." But resistance hardened. Policy versus humanity, ink versus pain. May 20th, 1945. The first full application of Margaret's care map took shape in Camp 9. British and German nurses side by side. Changes started as simple shifts, adjusted rations, covert medical swaps, new sleep rotations. Test data grew, fever rates fell, anxiety lessened, suicide attempts dropped, fear clung to every step. British officers patrolled the barracks, skeptical. But Anna, treated for typhus after Margaret's intervention, told a fellow POW, "They care for us, truly, not like before." By dawn, British field medics reported the camp's first unbroken night of sleep. The turning point came when a local Red Cross inspection cited Margaret's logbooks as a model for humane approach in hostile conditions. Field commanders looked at the numbers, mortality dropping, hope returning. "She's either lucky or we missed something vital," admitted the camp major. A quiet relief settled over the wire, packed in the hush of morning, the quiet hum of respectful care. The first test had worked against all odds. June 1945. The care map concept, quietly sketched by Margaret Price, was trialed in 3 additional POW camps. Each time, local staff resisted, some fearing punishment, others clinging to doctrine. Yet the numbers didn't lie. Reports from Lübeck, Osnabrück, and Bergen-Belsen revealed a remarkable shift. In camps that practiced Margaret's methods, the mortality rate for German women POWs fell by over 40% within 4 weeks. Incidents of violence dropped. Camp medical memoranda showed marked improvements in psychological health and even cooperation with British nurses. Inspectors from the Red Cross described these sites as models for future humanitarian management, and the British Medical Command quietly urged other regions to adopt similar procedures. Anna wrote to a surviving relative in Dresden, "The British are strange. They line us up for showers, bring clean garments. Some cry, shocked at the kindness. They joke, share soap. We stare at them, not knowing how to live again." Resistance dissolved faster than anyone predicted. Even hardened British officers, some with dark memories of the Blitz, found themselves treating German women as fellow sufferers, not enemies. A German nurse, Helga, recounted, "I expected torture, but got tea and hope. For a while I was human again. Sometimes I watched the British soldiers just to remember gentleness." By September 1945, the care map approach and British nursing adaptation had become standard in over a dozen Allied-run camps in Germany and occupied Belgium. Reports poured in. Accident rates, suicide attempts, and contagious diseases plunged compared to control camps that maintained strict military discipline. Statistics told the story. Typhus deaths dropped to under 10% of previous levels. Suicides, once a weekly tragedy, became rare. Red Cross staff described the emotional relief, not just for prisoners, but for guards. Even skeptical British officers admitted their astonishment. Every protocol textbook was rewritten by field nurses. Against all odds, their methods saved hundreds, maybe thousands. Some German women, clutching ration cards, stared at British soldiers with open disbelief. "We've never seen men like this," they whispered. echoing Anna's words. Mild human decency, a hand on the shoulder, clean socks, a real meal, became a revolution in spirit. Within months, Margaret Price and her colleagues' approach was quietly woven into the official British military handbook for POW management. Years later, the Red Cross cited these WWII British camps as proof that kindness and intelligence can change the fate of even the bitterest enemies. Margaret did not seek fame. Most accounts mention only a stubborn nurse and her map. But every British-run POW camp in post-war Europe bore the imprint of her innovation. German women, still haunted by loss, remembered the strange peace behind British wire and the soldiers whom they could watch with simple curiosity, not fear. Anna, decades later, still recalled, "He offered me tea. I'd never seen a soldier do such a thing. It taught me how to hope." As the world moved on, the invisible revolution endures. In every Geneva guideline updated, every humanitarian camp established, every life saved by the refusal to accept needless suffering. Summer 1948. The last German women POWs are led from British camps to repatriation trains. Their clothes are fresh-pressed, medical checks performed. For some, the journey ahead, back to a ruined homeland, feels more daunting than captivity ever did. A handful, like Anna, watch British guards in silent gratitude. She writes, "They freed me not with bars or orders, but with proof that mercy exists even in war." For the British nurses and officers, recognition rarely comes. Margaret Price and her counterparts, like Captain Margaret Ellis and Dr. Ellen Bradford, returns to civilian life with no fanfares, just the quiet knowledge that their insistence on decency added a hidden chapter to the war's brutal ledger. Bradford's diary, discovered years later, reads, "I washed hands that were rough with hunger and endless labor. They clung to me, some crying, some silent. All they wanted was to be seen, to be human." Nearly 12,400 German women passed through British camps by 1948. Most would tell their children, decades later, about the day they were given soap, food, or merely shown respect by a uniformed stranger. Their memory of British soldiers, sometimes awkward, sometimes almost fatherly, endured as a strange, vital thread in the aftermath of destruction. The revolution is complete when it becomes invisible. Now, camp management protocols, much of modern humanitarian law, and even the most basic compassion in crisis zones owe a silent debt to what happened behind those barbed wires. Some of the former nurses lived long enough to see their insistence on empathy acknowledged in British Army manuals. Most were simply forgotten, their work absorbed into routine. But every time a stranger is shown unexpected kindness in the darkness, their legacy is carried forward. "He never sought fame, only fewer funerals," said a fellow British officer of one of the originators. Every humanitarian camp in the world still carries his idea and his refusal to accept needless death. If stories like these move us, let them be a reminder. In every era, there is room for moral courage and for the small, stubborn choices that keep civilization alive in the face of barbarism. Subscribe to our channel to discover more stories that change the world, not just through weapons, but through the refusal to turn away from suffering. For the British nurses and officers who inspired change, wartime heroics faded quickly into civilian anonymity. Margaret Eva Price, a real nursing sister whose exhaustive diaries chronicled the endless convoys, field improvisations, and care for all nationalities, never sought recognition. After the war, she served quietly as matron in Sussex, remembered for her compassion and leadership rather than her wartime reforms. Her diaries, recovered by family decades later, brimmed with exhaustion and understated pride. "When the men arrived in the wards, our first care was to get them to bed and clean, then fed. To feel human again counted for much. Though so little was possible, we tried to give them the very best that could be managed." Nurse Ellen Bradford, another key figure, also faded from military history into gentle routine, serving the elderly, advocating small comforts, telling only close friends how she'd insisted, "Even the enemy deserves decency" during the war years. Margaret Price's care map and similar innovations, handwritten logs, personalized ration routes, barter networks with local civilians, were barely acknowledged in official narratives, but their effect echoed long after demobilization. For German women POWs, the transition from captivity to a devastated homeland carried both scars and kernels of hope. Anna, now a mother herself, would recount to her daughter, "They took away our papers, but never our humanity. Some nights I still dream of that strange British nurse who wrote down my name and made me feel real." Most returned to shattered towns, Hamburg in ruins, Dresden hollowed, but carried a modest, hard-won lesson, that war's end does not erase the human need for kindness. Some never spoke of captivity, while others helped start post-war relief agencies, passing on the message that even enemy nations could show decency. In rare reunions decades later, survivors told oral historians, "We never forgot those days behind the British wire. We learned what forgiveness could mean, not as forgetfulness, but as an opening for new life." Within NATO, the Geneva Conventions, and modern refugee protocols, echoes of these wartime innovations persist. Procedures for managing POWs and civilian detainees in later conflicts, Korea, Vietnam, Bosnia, consulted British examples drawn directly from the care map and post-war Red Cross reports. Medical students and young officers would one day study British POW camp management 1945, finding between the lines the quiet assertion that even in war's harshest winter, a refusal to abandon conscience changed the world. The legacy became, in the end, invisible, a silent blueprint for how to turn war's aftermath into the soil of renewed civilization. The war's aftermath, for both British caregivers and German survivors, unfolded against the vast tides of European transformation. The British occupation extended into the late 1940s. Their duty, as described in official records, was more than governance. It became an experiment in human reconstruction. German women, particularly those who had served as auxiliaries or been swept up in anti-aircraft and support roles, faced intersecting legacies of suspicion, poverty, and new beginnings. Many emerged from camps only to be scapegoated for disease outbreaks, abandoned with children, and denied marriages to their British partners. British nurses watched all this with sorrow, recognizing that true peace often lagged behind formal surrender. Ravensbrück and other camps became grim symbols of unspeakable violence and systematic destruction, with some 120,000 women and children incarcerated and tens of thousands murdered or worked to death. Yet even in these sites, brief moments of kindness offered by rare Allied staff stood out in survivors' memories as anchors amid chaos. Precise statistics remain elusive, but records confirm that post-war British POW camps held hundreds of thousands of German prisoners, peaking at over 400,000 in 1946. Among these were thousands of women, clerks, medical staff, auxiliaries, who experienced British discipline, but also a unique form of mercy in many camps. The death rate among female POWs plummeted where humane interventions took hold, and testimonies collected decades later praised the acts of decency that seemed impossible during war's moral collapse. Survivors' oral histories and nursing diaries from the era compose a mosaic of small rebellions against cruelty. A blanket given to a stranger, a night's safety, an unexpected cup of tea. Their memories outlasted the paper trails and statistics, carried forward through family stories as proof that the world could begin again. What endures is neither policy nor doctrine, but the invisible revolution, the realization, inside and outside the wire, that dignity does not require the permission of war. British nurses and officers, with their small choices, shifted the culture of captivity for generations. German women, survivors of devastation, would sometimes describe their time behind British wire as a strange interlude, terrifying, yet marked by glimpses of hope. As Anna put it, "We never understood how men who had bombed our cities might choose, in the end, to treat us as people. Every careful kindness, the soap, the clean bed, made freedom possible." Epilogue and call to reflection. The forgotten nurse, the silent sergeant, the enemy who turned out to be human too. These are the true architects of history, the ones whose sketches, stubbornness, and small mercies shape civilization more lastingly than any gun or order. He never sought fame, only fewer funerals. Every camp in the world still carries his idea and his refusal to accept needless death. If these stories moved you, help others rediscover the hope, courage, and innovation that quietly changed the world. Subscribe for more untold histories, where every breakthrough is also a lesson in how to be human.